actually been working on some scriptures to come up to share with you. I think would be very exciting. I'm excited about the second stick that actually supports the first stick. And when it all comes together, it paints a beautiful picture. So I'm excited to share that with you. But in the meantime, I'm going to share this book here. It said, the startling new discovery about the true ancestry of the Jewish people. It will cause a stir. John Barkham Reviews. Author Koestler, the 13th Tribe. We'll see if I can go ahead and get through with this book. There's a lot of information in there, and as you see, it's a lot of information, and the lettering is small. So that means and then it's over 200 pages. So that makes it really even though it's a small book, before to make a video and read the details, it may take more than one video. We'll see. So, turn the music down a little bit. Also, this music does not belong to me. Got it off of YouTube and appreciate those who created it. I do not plan on profiting from it. This for your listening pleasure to fill the space in the background. It says author Koestler, the 13th Tribe, the Khazar Empire, and its heritage. I may just read some parts and skip over some parts. Like I said, if you're interested, go to and pick up your own. I'm just trying to whet your appetite. Part 1. Rise and fall of the Khazars. In Khazaria, sheep, honey, and Jews exist in large quantities. 1. Rise. About the time when Charlemagne, and if you look at another video I made recently, it talks about Charlemagne, and I didn't really know this myself until I kind of looked into a little history and found out that Charlemagne was indeed what they call a Jew or an Israelite. But what I found out over a recent study, last few years, that Charlemagne was not the Jew that we thought he was. He was a so-called, what they call today, a so-called African American. But let me move on. About the time when Charlemagne was crowned emperor of the West, the eastern confines of Europe between the Caucasus and the Volga were ruled by a Jewish state known as Khazar Empire. At the peak of its power, from the 7th to the 10th century AD, it played a significant part in shaping the destinies of medieval and consequently of modern Europe. The Byzantine Empire and historian Constantine Peregrinus 916-959 must have been well aware of this when he recorded in his treatise on Cordoba that letters addressed to the Pope of Rome and similarly those to the Emperor of the West had a gold seal worth 2 solidi attached to them, whereas messages of the king of the Khazars displayed a seal worth 3 solidi. This is not flattery, but real politic. In the period with which we are concerned, wrote Bury, it is probable the Khan of the Khazars was of little less important in view of the imperial foreign policy than Charles the Great and his successors. The country of the Khazars, a people of Turkish stock, occupied a strategic key position at the vital gateway between the Black Sea and the Caspian, where the great eastern powers of the period confronted each other. It acted as a buffer protecting Byzantine against invasions by the lusty barbarian tribesmen of the northern steppes, Bulgars, Magyars, Pachiniks, etc., and later the Vikings and the Russians. But equally, or even more important, both from the point of view of the Byzantine diplomacy and of Europe history, is the fact that the Khazars almost effectively blocked the Arabs' avalanche in its most devastating early stages and thus prevented the Muslim conquest of Eastern Europe. Professor Dunlop of Columbia University, a leading authority on the history of the Khazars, having given a conscious summary of this decisive yet virtually unspoken episode. The Khazar country lay across the natural line of advance of the Arabs. Within a few years of the death of Muhammad, AD 632, the armies of the Caliphate, sweeping northward through the wreckage of two empires and carrying all before them, reaches the great mountain barrier of the Caucasus. This barrier once passed the road. Let me make sure I read that right. This barrier once passed, the road lay open to the lands of Eastern Europe. As it was on the line of the Caucasus, and the Arabs met the forces of the organized military power, would effectively prevented them from extending their conquests in this direction. The wars of the Arabs and the Khazars, which lasted more than 100 years, though little known, have thus considerable historical importance. The Franks of Charles Martel on the field of Tours turned the tide of the Arab invasion. At about the same time, the area to Europe in the east was hardly less acute. The victorious Muslims were met and held by forces of the Khazar kingdom. It can scarcely be doubted that but for existence of the Khazars in the region north of the Caucasus, Byzantine, the bulwark of European civilization is in the east, would have found itself outflanked by the Arabs, and the history of the Christendom and Islam might well have been very different what we know. It is perhaps not surprising, given these circumstances, that in 732, after a resounding Khazar victory over the Arabs, the future Emperor Constantine V married Khazar princes. In due time, their son became Emperor Leo IV, known as Leo the Khazar. Ironically, the last battle in the war, AD 737, ended in a Khazar defeat. But by that time, the impetus of the Muslim Holy War was spent, and the Caliphate was rocked by internal dissensions, and the Arab invaders retraced their steps across the Caucasus without having gained a permanent foothold in the north, whereas the Khazars became more powerful than they had previously been. A few years later, probably AD 740, the king, his court, and the military ruling class embraced the Jewish faith, and Judaism became the state religion of the Khazars. No doubt, their contemporaries were as astonished by this decision as modern scholars were when they came across the evidence in the Arab, Byzantine, Russian, and Hebrew sources. One of the most recent comments is to be found in the work by Hungarian Marxist historian Dr. Anton Barta. His book on the Magyar society in the 8th and 9th centuries have several chapters in the Khazars, as during most of that period the Hungarians were ruled by them. Yet, Their conversation to Judaism is discussed in a single paragraph. With obvious embarrassment, it reads, our investigations cannot go into problems pertaining to the history of ideas, but we must call the reader's attention to the matter of the Khazars' kingdom's state religion. It was the Jewish faith which became the official religion of the ruling strata of society. Needless to say, the acceptance of the Jewish faith as the state religion of an ethnically non-Jewish people could be subject to interesting speculation. We shall, however, confine ourselves to the remark that this official conversion in defense of Christian Christianizing of Byzantine, the Muslim influence from the East, and in spite of the political pressure of these two powers, to a religion which had no support from any political power, but was persecuted by nearly all, has come as a surprise to all historians concerned with the Khazars, and cannot be considered as accidental, but must be regarded as a sign of the independent policy pursued by that kingdom, which leaves us only slightly more bewildered than before. Yet, where the source differed in minor detail, the major facts are beyond dispute. What is in dispute is the fate of the Jewish Khazars after the destruction of their empire in the 12th or the 13th century. On this problem, the sources are scant, but various late medieval Khazar settlements are mentioned in the Crimea, in the Ukraine, in Hungary, Poland, Lithuania. The general picture that emerges from these fragmentary pieces of information is of a migration of Khazar tribes and communities into those regions of Eastern Europe, mainly Russia and Poland, where at the dawn of the modern age, the greatest concentration of Jews were found. This has led several historians to conjecture that a substantial part, and perhaps the majority of Eastern Jews, and hence the world Jewry, might be of Khazar and not of Semitic origin. The far-reaching implication of this hypothesis may explain the great caution exercised by historians in approaching this subject. If they do not avoid it altogether, this in the 1973 edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica, Encyclopedia Judaica, the article Khazars is signed by Dunlap, but there is a separate section dealing with Khazar Jews after the fall of the kingdom, signed by the edition and written with obvious intent to avoid upsetting believers in the dogma of the chosen race. The Turkish-speaking Karaites, a fundamentalist Jewish sect of the Crimea, Poland, and elsewhere have affirmed the connection with the Khazars, which is perhaps confirmed by evidence from folklore and anthropology, as well as language. There seems to be a considerable amount of evidence attesting to the continued presence in Europe and descendants of the Khazars. How important in quantitative terms is that presence of the Caucasian sons of Japheth in the text of Shem? How important in quantitative terms is that presence of the Caucasian sons of Japheth in the text of Shem? One of the most radical propounders of the hypothesis concerning the Khazar origins of Jewry is the professor of the medieval Jewish history of Tel Aviv University, A.N. Polya. His book Khazaria in Hebrew was published in 1944 in Tel Aviv, and a second edition in 1951. In his introduction, he writes that the facts demand a new approach both to the problem of the relations between the Khazar Jewry and other Jewish communities, and to the question of how far we can go in regarding this Khazar Jewry as the nucleus of the large Jewish settlement in Eastern Europe. The descendants of this settlement, those who stayed where they were, those who immigrated to the United States and to other countries, and those who went to Israel constitute now the large majority of the world Jews. This was written before the full context of the Holocaust was known, but that does not alter the fact that the large majority of surviving Jews in the world is of Eastern Europe, and thus perhaps mainly of Khazar origin. If so, this would mean that their ancestors came from the Jordan, but from the Volga. Read that again. If so, this would mean that their ancestors came not from the Jordan, but from the Volga, not from Canaan, but from the Caucasus, once believed to be the cradle of Aryan race, and that genetically they are more closely related to Hun, Uighur, and Magyar tribes than to the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Should this turn out to be the case, then the term anti-Semitism will become void of meaning, based on misapprehensions shared by both the killers and their victims. The story of Khazar Empire, as it slowly emerges from the past, begins to look like the most cruel hoax which history has ever perpetrated. Now, Attila was, after all, merely the king of a kingdom of tents. His state passed away, whereas the despised city of Constantinople remained a power. The tents vanished, the towns remained. The Hun state was a whirlwind. Thus, Castle, a 19th century Orientalist, implying that Khazars shared a similar fate. Yet the Hun presence on the European scene lasted a mere 8 years, whereas the king of the Khazars held it on for the best part of 4 centuries. They too lived chiefly in tents, but they also had large urban settlements and were in the process of transformation from a tribe of nomadic warriors into a nation of farmers, cattle breeders, fishermen, vine growers, traders, and skilled craftsmen. Soviet archaeologists have unearthed evidence for a relatively advanced civilization, which was altogether different from the Han whirlwind. They found the trace of villages extending over several miles, with houses connected by galleries to huge cattle sheds, sheep pens, and stables. These measured, 3 minus 3.5 times 10 minus 14 meters, and supported by columns. Some remaining ox plows showed remarkable craftsmanship, and so did the preserved artifacts, buckles, claps, ornamental saddle plates. Of particular interest were the foundations, sunk into the ground, of houses built in a circular shape. According to the ground of houses built in circular shape, according to the Soviet archaeologists, these were found all over the territories inhabited by the Khazars, and were of an earlier date than their normal rectangular buildings. Obviously, the round houses symbolize the transition from Cordoba dome shape to the permanent dwellings, from nomadic to settled, or rather semi-settled existence. For the contemporary Arab source tells us that the Khazars only stayed in their towns, including even their capitals, during the winter. Some spring, they packed their tents, left their houses, and sailed forth with their sheep or cattle into steppes, or camped in their cornfields or vineyards. The excavations also showed that the kingdom was, during this later period, surrounded by an elaborate chain of fortifications dating from the 8th and 9th centuries, which protected its southern frontiers facing the open steppes. These fortresses formed a rough, similar circular arc from the Crimea, with the Khazars ruled for a time, across the lower reaches of the Donetsk and the Don to the Volga, while towards the south they were protected by the Caucasus, to the west by the Black Sea, and the east by the Khazar Sea, the Caspian. However, the northern chain of fortifications marked merely an inner ring, protecting the stable core of the Khazar country. The actual boundaries of their rule over the tribes of the north fluctuated according to the fortunes of war. At the peak of their power, they controlled or extracted or exacted tribute from some 30 different nations and tribes inhabiting the vast territories between the Caucasus and the Aral Sea, the Ural Mountains, the town of Kiev, and the Ukrainian steppes. The people in the Khazar sovereignty included the Bulgars, Burtas, Guz, Magyars, Hungarians, the Gothic, and the northwestern Willars. Beyond these extended dominions, Khazar armies also raided Georgia and Armenia and penetrated into Arab Caliphate as far as Mosul. In the words of the Soviet archaeologist M.I. Artamonov, until the 9th century, the Khazars had no rival to their supremacy in the region north of Black Sea and the adjoining steppe and forest regions of the Dnieper. The Khazars were the supreme masters of the southern half of Eastern Europe for a century and a half, and presented a mighty bulwark blocking the Euro-Caspian gateway from Asia to Europe. During this whole period, they held back the onslaught of the nomadic tribes from the east. Taking a bird's eye view of the history of the great nomadic empire of the east, the Khazar kingdom occupies an intermediary position in time, size, decree, and civilization between the Hun and Avar Empire, which preceded, and the Mongol Empire that succeeded it. But who were the remarkable people, remarkable as by their power and achievement as by their conversion to a religion of outcasts. The description that have come down to originate in hostile sources and cannot be taken at face value. As to the Khazars, an Arab chronicler writes, they are to the north of the inhabited earth towards the seventh climb, having over their heads the constellation of the Claw. Their land is cold and wet. Accordingly, their complexions are white, their eyes blue, their hair flowing and predominantly reddish, their bodies large, and their natures cold. Their general aspect is wild. After a century of warfare, the Arab writer Osby had no great sympathy for the Khazars, nor had the Georgian or Armenian scribes, whose countries of a much older culture had been repeatedly devastated by the Khazar horsemen. A Georgian chronicle, echoing an ancient tradition, identifies them with the host of God and Magog, wild men with the hideous faces and the manners of wild beasts, eaters of blood. An Armenian writer refers to the horrible multitude of Khazars, which isolate, broad lashes faces, and long felling hair like women. Lastly, the Arab geographer Istakari, one of the main Arab sources, has this to say: the Khazars do not resemble the Turks. They are black-haired and are two kinds, one called the Arab-Khazars. One called the Arab-Khazars, black Khazars, who are swarthy, virgin on deep black, as if they were a kind of Indian, and a white kind, Khazars, who are strikingly handsome. This is more flattering, but only adds to the confusion, for it was customary among the Turkish people to refer to the ruling classes or clans as white, to the lower strata as black. Thus, there is no reason to believe that the white Bulgars were whiter than the black Bulgars, or that the white Huns, the Ephthalites, who invaded India and Persia in the 5th and 6th centuries, were of fairer skin than the other Hun tribe which invaded Europe. Takuri, black-skinned Khazars, as much as in his and his colleagues' writing, were based on hearsay and legend, and we are none the wiser regarding the Khazars' physical appearance of their ethnic origins. The last question can only be answered in a vague and general way, but it's equally frustrating to inquire into the origins of the Huns, Alans, Alvars, Bulgars, Magyars, Baskars, Burtas, Sabars, Ugars, Saragars, Anogars, Usagars, Kuchagars, Tarnikas, Tarniks, Koltragars, Kalbors, Akabors, Zaminders, Pincheniks, Ghouls, Kumans, Kipchaps, and dozen other tribes or other people who at one time or another in the lifetime of the Khazar kingdom passed through the turnstiles of those migratory playgrounds. Even the Huns, of whom we know much more, are of a certain origin. Their name is apparently derived from the Chinese Haiyan Lu, which designates warlike nomads in general, while other nations apply the name Hung as similarly indiscriminate way to nomadic hordes of all kinds, including the white Huns mentioned above, the Cybars, the Magars, and the Khazars. The 1st century AD, the Chinese drove these disagreeable Han neighbors westward, and thus started one of those periodic avalanches which swept for many centuries from Asia towards the west. From the 5th century onward, many of these westbound tribes were called by the generic name of Turks. The term is also supposed to be of Chinese origin, apparently derived from the name of Hill. It was subsequently used to refer to a tribe who spoke languages with certain common characteristics, the Turkic language group, thus the term Turk, in the sense which it was used by medieval writers and often also by modern ethnologists, refer primarily to language and not to race. In this sense, the Huns and Khazars were Turkic people. The Khazar language was supposedly a Chevash dialect of Turkish, which still survives in the autonomous Chuvash Soviet Republic between the Volga and the Sura. The Chuvash people are actually believed to be the descendants of the Bulgars, who spoke a dialect similar to the Khazar. But all that connections are rather tenuous based on the more or less speculative deductive of Oriental philologists. All we can say with safety is that the Khazars were a Turkish tribe who erupted from the Asian steppes probably in the 5th century of our era. The origin of the name Khazar and the modern derivation to which it gave rise has also been the subject of much ingenious speculation. Most likely, the word is derived from the Turkish root "gaz," to wander, and simply means nomad. Of greater interest to the non-specialists are some alleged modern derivations from it, among them the Russian Cossack and Hungarian. It has, like in the bottom, the small point at the bottom of the page, it said, "It is amusing to note that while the British in the World War I use the term Hun in the same pejorative sense, and my native Hungary school children were taught to look up to our glorious Hun forefathers with patriotic pride. An exclusive rowing club of Budapest was called Honia, and Attila is still a popular first name, but not the Magyars, whose language belongs to the Finno-Ugrian language group. Page 22, it says the 13th tribe. It says Khazar, both signifying martial horsemen, and also the German Ketzer, heretic, i.e. Jew. If these derivations are correct, they would show that the Khazars had a considerable impact on the imagination of a variety of people in the Middle Ages. All right, let's see. It says 4. Some Persian and Arab chronicles provide an attractive combination of legend and gossip column. They may start with the creation and end with stop-press tidbits. Thus, Yaqubi, a 9th century Arab historian, traces the origins of Khazars back to Japhet, third son of Noah. The Japhet motive recurs frequently in the literature, while other legends can connect them with Abraham or Alexander the Great. One of the earliest factual references to the Khazars occurs in the Syriac Chronicle by Zachariah Reader, dating from the middle of the 6th century. It mentions the Khazars in a list of people who inhabit the region of the Caucasus. Other sources indicate that they were already much in evidence a century earlier and immediately connected with the Huns. In AD 448, the Byzantine Emperor Theodosius II sent an embassy to Attila, which included a famed rhetorician by the name of Priscus. He kept a minute account not only of the diplomatic negotiations, but also of the court intrigues and going on in Attila's sumptuous banqueting hall. He was in fact the perfect gossip columnist, and is still one of the main sources of information about Hun customs and habits. But Croesus also was anecdotes to tell about a people subject to the Huns, who he calls Akhazars, That is very likely the Khazars are the white Khazars, as distinct from the black Khazars. The Byzantine Emperor, Croesus tells us, tries to win this warrior race over to his side, but the greedy Khazar chieftain named Caradoc considered the bribe offered to him inadequate and sided with the Huns. Attila defeated Caradoc's rival chieftain, installed him as the sole ruler of the Arab-Khazars, and invited him to visit his court. Caradoc thanked him profusely for the invitation and went on to say that it would be too hard on a mortal man to look on the face of a god. For as one cannot stare into the sun dish, even less could one look into the face of the greatest god without suffering injury. Attila must have been pleased, for he conferred cowardice in his rule. Cresque's chronicle confirms that the Khazars appeared on the European scene about the middle of the 5th century as a people under Hunnish sovereignty, and may be regarded together with Magyars and other tribes as later offspring of Attila's Horde. 5. The collapse of the Hun Empire after Attila's death left a powerful vacuum in Eastern Europe, through which one more wave after wave of nomadic hordes swept from east to west, prominent among the Uyghurs or the Avars. The Khazars, during most of their period, seem to be happily occupied with raiding the rich Trans-Caucasian region of Georgia and Armenia and collecting precious plunder. During the second half of the 6th century, they became the dominant force among the tribes north of the Caucasus. A number of these tribes, the Sabars, Saragors, Samanders, Balandars, etc., are from this date onward no longer mentioned by name in the sources. They have been subdued or absorbed by the Khazars. The toughest resistance, apparently, was offered by the powerful Bulgars, but they too were crushingly defeated circa 641, and as a result, the nation split into two. Some of them migrated westward to Danube, into the region of modern Bulgaria, others none eastward toward the Middle Volga. The latter remaining under Khazar suzerainty, we shall frequently encounter both Danube Bulgars and Volga Bulgars in the course of their narrative. But before the coming of sovereign state, the Khazars still had to serve their apprenticeship under another short-lived power, the so-called West Turkish Empire, or the Turkic Kingdom. It was the confederation of tribes held together by a ruler, the Kagan or the Kaga, a title which the Khazar rulers too were subsequently to adopt. This first Turkish state, if one may call it that, lasted for a century, circa 550 to 650, and then fell apart, leaving hardly any trace. However, it was only after the establishment of this kingdom that the name Turk was used to apply to a specific nation, as distinct from the Turkic-speaking people like the Khazars and the Bulgars. The Khazars have been under Han tutelage, then under Turkish tutelage. After the eclipse of the Turks in the middle of the 7th century, it was their turn to rule the kingdom of the north. As the Persians, the Byzantines came to call it, according to one tradition, the great Persian king Khosrow Anushirwan the Blessed had 3 golden guest thrones in his palace, reserved for the emperors of the Byzantine China of the Khazar. No state visits from these content states materialized, and the golden thrones, if they existed, must have served a purely symbolic purpose. But whether fact or legend, the state fits well with Emperor Constantine's official account of the triple gold seal assigned by the imperial chancery to the ruler of the Khazars. 6. Page 25, section 6. Thus, during the few decades of the 7th century, just before the Muslim hurricane was unleashed from Arabia, the Middle East was dominated by a triangle of powers: Byzantine, Persia, and the West Turkish Empire. The first 2 of these had been waging intermittent war against each other for a century, and both seemed on the verge of collapse. In the sequel, Byzantium recovered, but the Persian kingdom was soon to meet its doom, and the Khazars were actually in on the kill. They were still nominally under the suzerainty of the West Turkish kingdom, within which they represented the strongest effective force into which they were soon to succumb. Accordingly, in 627, the Roman Empire, Heraclius, concluded a military alliance with the Khazars, the first of the several to follow, in preparing his decisive campaign against Persia. There are several versions of the role played by the Khazars in that campaign, which seems to have been somewhat inglorious, but the principal facts are well established. The Khazars provided Heraclius with 40,000 horsemen under the chieftain named Zeebel, who participated in the advance into Persia, but then presumably fed up with the cautious strategy of the Greeks, turned back to lay siege on Tiflis. This was unsuccessful, but the next year they again joined forces with Heraclius, took the Jaguarian capital, and returned with rich plunder. Gibbon has been a colorful description based on the Theophanes of the first meeting between the Roman emperor and the Khazar chieftain. Page 26. Of the Khazars, such voluntary homage and important aid were entitled to the warmest and acknowledgments, and the emperor, taking off his own diadem, placed it on the head of the Turkish prince, whom he had settled with a tender embrace in the appellation of son. After a sumptuous banquet, he represented Zeebo with the plate and ornament, the gold, the gems, and the silk, which he had then used at the imperial table, and with his own hand distributed rich jewels and earrings to his new allies. In a secret interview, he produced the portrait of his daughter, Eudocia, condescended to flatter the barbarian with the promise of a fair and august bride, and obtained an immediate succor of 40,000 horse. Eudocia, or Epiphania, was the only daughter of Heraclius by his first wife. The promise to give her in marriage to the Turk indicated once more the high value set by the Byzantine court on the Khazar alliance. However, the marriage came to naught because Zebel died while Eudocia and her suite were on their way to him. There is also an ambivalent reference in Theophanes to the effect that Zebel presented his son, a beardless boy, to the emperor as a quid pro quo. This is another picturesque passage in the Armenian Chronicle, quoting the text that might be called an order of mobilization issued by Khazar rulers for the second campaign against Persia. It was addressed to all tribes and people under Khazar authority, inhabitants of the mountains and the plains, living under roofs or the open sky, having their heads shaved or wearing their hair long. This gives us the first intimation of the heterogeneous ethnic mosaic that was to compose the Khazar Empire. The real Khazars who ruled were probably always a minority, as the Austrians were in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. The Persian state never recovered, this is section 7, the Persian state never recovered from the crushing defeat inflicted on it by the Emperor Heraclius in 627. There was a revolution. The king was slain by his own son, who in turn died a few months later. child was elevated to the throne, and after 10 years of anarchy and chaos, the first Arab armies to erupt on the scene delivered the coup de grace to Sassanid Empire. At about the same time, the West Turkish Confederation dissolved into tribal components. The new triangle of power replaced the previous one: the Islamic Caliphate, the Christian Byzantine, and the newly emerged Khazar Kingdom of the North. It fell to the latter to be the brunt of the Arab attack in its initial stages, and to protect the plains of Eastern Europe from the invaders. In the first 20 years of Hegel, Muhammad's flight to Medina in 1622, Muhammad's flight to Medina in 622, with which the Arab calendar starts, the Muslims had conquered Persia, Syria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and surrounded by this Byzantine heartland, the present-day Turkey. In a deadly semicircle which extended from the Mediterranean to the Caucasus and the southern shores of Caspian, the Caucasus was a formidable natural obstacle, but no more formidable than the Pyrenees, and it would be negotiated by the pass barrier or bypass through the defile of Dardan along the Caspian shore. This fortified defile, called by the Arabs Bab al-Abwa, the Gate of Gates, was a kind of historic turnstile through which Khazars and other marauding tribes had from time immemorial attacked the countries of the south and retreated again. Now it was the turn of the Arabs. Between 642 and 652, they repeatedly broke through the Darban Gate and advanced deep into Khazaria, attempting to capture Balandar, the newest town, and thus secure its foothold on the European side of the Caucasus. They were beaten back on every occasion on this first phase of the Arab-Khazar War. The last time in 652, in a great battle in which both sides used artillery, catapults, and ballistic 4,000 Arabs were killed, including their commander, Abd al-Rahman ibn Rabi'a. The rest fled in disorder across the mountains. For the next 30 or 40 years, the Arabs did not attempt any further incursions into Khazar stronghold. Their main attack was now aimed at Byzantine. On several occasions, they laid siege to Constantinople by land and by sea. Had they been able to outflank the capital across the Caucasus and around the Black Sea, the fate of the Roman Empire would probably have been sealed. The Khazars, in the meantime, have subjugated the Bulgars and the Magyars, completed their western expansion into the Ukraine and Crimea, but these were no longer haphazard raids to amass booty and prisoners. They were wars of conquest, incorporating the conquered people into the empire with a stable administration ruled by the mighty Kagan, who appointed his provincial governors.
Music. Download the app today.
Excuse me, let me
Get a trial of Music Premium on us. Restrictions apply.
All right, like I said, I had no intention that the commercial break was going to come in, and I'm not trying to gain any profit for anything they're doing. That was just a music in the background I was playing just for your comfort when I read this long book. So I mean no to gain anything from it, no profit from it. And it's not mine. All right, let's see where did I leave off. Mighty Kagan, who appointed his provincial governors to administer and levy taxes in the conquered territories. At the beginning of the 8th century, neither state was sufficiently consolidated for the Khazars to take the offensive against the Arabs. From a distance of more than 1,000 years, the period of intermediate warfare that followed the so-called Second Arab War, 722-37, looks like a series of tedious episodes on the local scale, following the same repetitive pattern. The Khazar cavalry, in their heavy armor, breaking through the pass of Daria or the gate of Gardan into the Caliph's domain to the south, followed by Arab counter rush through the same pass or to defile towards the Volga and back again. Looking thus through the wrong end of the telescope, one is reminded of the old jingle about the noble Duke of York, who had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and he marched them down again. In fact, the Arab source, though they often exaggerate, speak of armies of 100,000 or even 300,000 men engaged on either side, probably outnumbering the armies which decided the fate of the Western world at the Battle of Tours about the same time. The death-defying fanaticism which characterized these wars is illustrated by episodes such as the suicide by fire of the whole Khazar town as an alternative to surrender, the poisoning of the water supply of Bab al-Abwa by an Arab general, or by the traditional extortion which would halt the rout of a defeated Arab army and make it fight to the last man. To the guarding Muslims, not the fire. The joys of paradise being assured to every Muslim soldier killed in the Holy War. This is the rise, page 29. At one stage, during these 15 years of fighting, the Khazars overran Georgia and Armenia, inflicted a total defeat on the Arab army in the Battle of Arab-Khazar, AD 730, and advanced as far as Mosul and Diyarbakir, more than halfway to Damascus, capital of the Caliphate, but a freshly raised Muslim army steamed the tide, and the Khazars retreated homewards across the mountains. The next year, Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, most famed Arab general of his time, who had formerly commanded the siege of the Constantinople, took Balanjar and even got as far as Samanda, another large Khazar town further north. But once more, the invaders were unable to establish a permanent garrison, and once more they were forced to retreat across the Caucasus. A sigh of relief experienced in the Roman Empire assumed a tangible form through another dynastic alliance, when the heir to the throne was married to the Khazar princess, whose son was to rule Byzantium as Leo the Khazar. The last Arab campaign was led by the future Caliph Marwan II. It ended in a Pyrrhic victory. Marwan made an offer of alliance to the Khazar Kagan, then attacked by surprise through both passages. The Khazar army, unable to recover from the initial shock, retreated as far as the Volga. The Kagan was forced to ask for terms. Marwan, in accordance with the routine followed, asked for terms. Read that again. Marwan, in accordance with the Routine followed in another conquered countries, requested the Khagan's conversion to the true faith. The Khagan complied, but his conversion to Islam must have been an act of lip service, for no more is heard of an episode in Arab Byzantine sources. In contrast to the last effect of the establishment of Judaism as the state religion, which took place a few years later, content with the results achieved, Marwan bid farewell to Khazaria and marched, page 30, his army back to Transcaucasia without leaving any garrison, governor, or administrative apparatus behind. On the contrary, a short time later, he requested terms for another alliance with the Khazars against the rebellious tribe of the south. It had been a narrow escape, the reason which prompted Marwan's apparent magnanimity or a matter of conjecture. As much else in this bizarre chapter of history, perhaps the Arabs realized that unlike the relatively civilized Persians, Armenians, or Georgians, these ferocious barbarians in the north could not be ruled by a Muslim puppet prince or a small garrison. Yet, Marwan needed every man of his army to quell major rebellions in Syria and other parts of the Umayyad Caliphate, which was in the process of breaking up. Marwan himself was the chief commander in the civil wars that followed. It became in 744 the last of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphs, only to be assassinated 6 years later, with the Caliphate passed to the Abbasid dynasty. Man, I'm looking at this word. I don't know if that's true or not, but I gotta look it up. I haven't looked this up before. This is my first time reading this section. Umayyad, is that the Mayas in California? That's what I'm seeing through that word. I don't know, but that's what it looks like I'm seeing when I see that. The last of Umayyad caliphs, only to be assassinated 6 years later when the caliphate passed to the Abbasid dynasty. Given this, and then he called them savages and all these other things, that makes me think about how they always call the so-called African Americans. I'm just thinking what popped in my mind. That may not be true or not. That's why I'm saying this is what I'm seeing when I read that. And then he called them savages. I'm reading the Maya, and to me that word is mean Mayas, and Caliphs mean Californians. I don't know. Look that up. That's what popped in my mind. Only to be assassinated 6 years later when the caliphate passed to the Abbasid dynasty. Given his background, Marwan was simply not in a position to exhaust his resources by further wars with the Khazars. He had to content himself with teaching them a lesson which would deter them from further incursions across the Caucasus. Thus, the gigantic Muslim Princer movement across the Pyrenees in the west and across the Caucasus into Eastern Europe has halted at both ends about the same time, as Charles Martel's Franks saved Gaul and Western Europe. So the Khazars saved the eastern approaches to the Volga, the Danube, and the East Roman Empire itself. On this point, at least, the Soviet archaeologist and historian Artemonov and the American historian Dunlop are in a full agreement. I have already quoted the latter to the effect that but for the Khazars, Byzantine, the bulwark of European civilization to the east, would have found itself unflanked by the Arabs, and that history might have taken a different course. Artimonev is of the same opinion. Khazaria was the first feudal state in Eastern Europe, which ranked with the Byzantine Empire and the Arab Caliphate, and only due to the powerful Khazar attacks diverting the tide of the Arab armies to the Caucasus that Byzantine withstood them. Lastly, the professor of Russian history in the University of Oxford, Dmitry Obolensky, the main contribution of the Khazars to the world history was their success in holding the line of the Caucasus against the northward onslaught of the Arabs. Marwan was not only the last Arab general to attack the Khazars, he was also the last caliph to pursue the expansionist policy devoted, at least in theory, to the ideal of making Islam triumph all over the world. With the Abbasid caliphs, the war of conquest ceased, and revived influence of the old Persian culture created a mellower climate, and eventually gave rise to the splendors of Baghdad under Harun al-Rashid. Section 8. During the long lull between the First and Second Arab Wars, the Khazars became involved in one of the more lurid episodes of Byzantine history, characteristics of the time and of the role of the Khazars played in it. In AD 685, Justinian II, Rhino-Timitus, became East Roman Emperor at the age of 16. Gibbon, in his inimitable way, has drawn the youth's portrait. His passion was strong, his understanding was feeble, and he was intoxicated with foolish pride. His favorite ministers were two beings the least susceptible of human sympathy, a eunuch and a monk. The former corrected with emperor's mother with a scourge. The latter suspended the insolvent tributaries with their heads downward over a low and smoky fire. After 10 years of intolerable misrule, there was a revolution, and the new emperor, Leontius, ordered Justinian's mutilation and banishment. The amputation of his nose, perhaps his tongue, were imperfectly performed. The happy flexibility of the Greek language can oppose the name Rhino-Metius, cut off nose, and the mutilated tyrant was banished to Chersonese in Crim territory, a lonely settlement where corn, wine, and oil were imported as foreign luxuries. During his exile in Cherson, Justinian kept plotting to regain his throne. After 3 years, he saw his chances improving. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to move on, so I'm trying to get it all in. Two sections. I'll move on to section 2, just called the conversion. The religion of the Hebrews, writes Beery, had exercised a confound influence on the creed of Islam. Okay, I read this. Basically is in agreement with the what they were saying in what's it from Timbuktu, the book Babylon to Timbuktu, where it said that Islam had got basically all of its foundation for its form of religion from the Hebrew. About the one, I'm gonna use the term God, the one God, So it says the religion of the Hebrews, writes Beery, had exercised a profound influence on the creed of Islam. It had been a basis for Christianity. It had been scattered proselytes, but the conversion of the Khazars to the unbeliated religion of they have Jehovah, as they were Jehovah, is unique in history. What was the motivation of this unique event? It is not easy to get under the skin of a Khazar prince, covered as it was by a coat of mail. But if we reason in terms of power, politics, which obeys essentially the same rules throughout the ages, a fairly plausible analogical offers itself. At the beginning of the 8th century, the world was polarized between the two superpowers representing Christianity and Islam. Their ideological doctrine were welded to power politics pursued by classical methods of propaganda, subversions, and military conquest. The Khazar Empire represented the third force, which had proved equal to either of them, both as the adversary and ally. But it would only maintain its independence by accepting neither Christianity nor Islam, for either choice would have automatically subordinated it to the authority of the Roman Empire or the Caliph of Baghdad. There had been no lack of efforts by either court to convert the Khazars to Christianity or Islam, but all they resulted in was the exchange of diplomatic courtesies, dynastic intermarriages, and shifting military alliances based on mutual self-interest. Relying its military strength, the Khazar kingdom, with its hinterland of vassal tribes, was determined to preserve this position as the third force leading of uncommitted nations of the steppes. At the same time, their intimate contact with Byzantine and Caliphate had taught the Khazars that their primitive shamanism was not only barbaric and outdated compared to the great monotheistic creed, but also unable to confer to the elders the spiritual and legal authority which the rulers of the two theocratic world powers, the Caliph and the Emperor, enjoyed. Yet, the conversion to either creed would have meant submission to the end of the independence, and thus would have defeated its purpose. What could have been more logical than the embrace of a third creed, which was uncommitted towards either of the two, yet represented the venerable foundation of both? The apparent logic of the decision is, of course, due to the deceptive clarity of hindsight. Will you allow me, and I'm going to acknowledge I'm interjecting. Would you allow me to interject from him just using just a thought that came to me? It's not in the book, so I'm not saying this is what they're saying. Based on what I've come to know, because I am a professed Israelite by blood. I'm not professing to be Israeli, so I'm not making I'm not lying. Because these are thinking people, right? They didn't want to, from what I'm reading, they didn't want to fall under Islam nor Catholicism. That's who runs Christianity. They said, and because you know the so-called Negro, I'm just saying for consideration, this is not in the book, this is thought, this process of thinking. The so-called Negro has no power, no authority, no backing other than the Most High. The Most High allowed this to happen for a reason. So they took our identity, our religion, our God, quote unquote God, because in other words, we couldn't do anything about it. And we were taken into slavery and basically pushed aside as nobody because they already taken over our identity. But because they play by certain rules, they didn't call themselves Israelites, they called themselves Israelis. That's just a thought popped in my head as I'm reading this information. At the same time, the intimate contact with the Byzantine and the Caliphate had taught the Khazars that their primitive shamanism was not only barbaric and outdated compared to the great monotheistic creeds, but also unable to confer to the leaders of the spiritual and legal authority with the rulers of the two theocratic world powers, the Caliph and the Emperor enjoyed. Yet the conversation to either creed would have meant submission in the end of independence, and thus would have defeated its purpose. That could have been more logical than to embrace a third creed, which was uncommitted towards either of the two, yet represented the venerable foundation of both. The apparent logic of the decision is of course due to the deceptive clarity of hindsight. In reality, the conversion to Judaism required an act of genius. Yet both the Arab and the Hebrew sources on the history of the conversion, however, vary in detail, point to a line of reasoning as indicated above. To quote Berry once more, there can be no question that the ruler was actuated by political motives in adopting Judaism. To embrace Mohammedanism would have made him the spiritual dependent of the caliphs who attempted to press their faith in the Khazars. And in Christianity lay the danger of becoming an ecclesiastical vassal of the Roman Empire. Judaism, see, I didn't even read that. Judaism was a reputable religion with the sacred books which both Christians and Mohammedans respected. It has elevated him above the heathen barbarians and secured him against the interferences of the caliph or the emperor. But he did not adopt, along with circumcision, the intolerance of the Jewish code. He allowed the mass of his people to abide in their heathendom and worship their idols. Though the Khazar court's conversation was no doubt politically motivated, it would still be absurd to imagine that they embraced overnight, blindly, a religion whose tenets were unknown to them. In fact, however, they had well acquainted with the Jews and their religion observance for at least a century. before the conversion. So they watched them for over a century. Watched us for over a century. See, that's just me. That's my insight. And once again, that's not what they're saying. That's what popped in my mind, based on reading information. I'm just trying to keep what I'm thinking and not applying to what they're actually saying, so you won't confuse the two. Through the continued influx of a refugee from the religious persecution in Byzantine, and to a lesser extent from centuries in Asia Minor conquered by the Arabs, we know that Khazaria was a relative civilized country among the barbarians of the north, yet not committed either of the militant creeds, and so it became a natural haven for the periodic exodus of Jews under Byzantine rule, threatening by forced conversation and other pressures. Persecution in varied forms has started with Justinian I, 527 to 650. I'm sorry, Justinian I, 527 65, and assumed particularly vicious forms under Heraclius in the 7th century, Leo III in the 8th, Basil and Leo IV in the 9th, Romanus in the 10th. Thus, Leo III, who ruled during the 2 decades, immediately preceded the Khazar conversation to Judaism, attempted to end the anomaly of the tolerated status of Jews. At one blow, by the order of all his Jewish subjects to be baptized, although implementation of the order seemed to have been rather ineffective, it led to the flight of a considerable number of Jews from the Byzantine Masudi relics. In this city, Khazarians are Muslims, Christians, Jews, and pagans. The Jews are the king. The Jews are the king. His attendants and the Khazars of his kind. The king of the Khazars had already become a Jew in the Caliphate of Harun al-Rashid, and was joined by Jews from all lands of Islam and from the country of the Greeks, Byzantine. Indeed, the king of the Greeks at the present time, the year of the Haggaria 332 AD, 943 to 4, has converted the Jews in the kingdom of Christianity by coercion. Thus, many Jews took flight from the country of the Greeks to the Khazars, to Khazaria. The last 2 sentences quoted refer to events 200 years after the Khazar conversation and show persistently waves of persecution followed each other over the centuries. But the Jews were equally persistent. Many endured torture, and those who did not have the strength to resist returned later on to their fate, like dogs to their vomit. As one Christian chronicler graciously put it, equally picturesque is the description of the Hebrew writer of one method of forced conversion used under the Emperor Basil against the Jewish community of Oria in southern Italy. How did they force them? Anyone refused to accept their erroneous belief was placed in an olive mill under a wooden press and squeezed in the way olives are squeezed in the mill. Another Hebrew source remarks on the persecution under Emperor Romanus, the Greek king, to whom Masudi refers. See, that's why a lot of our people have been. Once again, I'm getting away from the 13 tribe book, and a thought popped up. That's what I'm saying, a thought. And that's why a lot of our people, the Hebrews, the Israelites, or are Hellenized to this day under pressure. Because they're forcing people to do things that's against the Most High. And if you will allow me to use a present day situation, I don't really know the whole situation, what's really going on behind the scenes, but what they put out there, the Nick Cannons of the world, what's the football player from Long Beach, his name? Can't think of his name right now, but they're putting the pressure on them to recant, even though it's the truth, what they're saying. Same thing, just different tactics. So another Hebrew source remarks on the persecution under the emperor Romanus, the Greek king to whom Masadi refers, and afterwards there will arise a king who will persecute them, not by destruction, but mercifully by driving them out of the country. The only mercy shown by history to those who took to flight and were driven to it was existence of Khazaria, both before and after the conversion. Before, it was a refuge haven. After, it became a kind of a national home. The refugees were products of a superior culture and were no doubt an important factor in creating a cosmopolitan, tolerant outlook, which is impressed the Arab Chronicle quoted before. Their influence and no doubt their proselytizing zeal would have made itself felt, and it would have made itself felt first and foremost at the court and among leading notables. They may have combined in their missionary efforts theological arguments and Masonic prophecies with a shrewd assessment of the political advantages the Khazars would derive from adopting a neutral religion. The exiles also brought with them Byzantine art and crafts, superior methods of agriculture and trade, and the square Hebrew alphabet. We do not know what kind of script the Khazars used before that, but the Forest of Ibn Nadim, a kind of universal. Page 62. Bibliography written circa AD 987 informs us that this time the Khazars used the Hebrew alphabet. So once they were converted, they started using the Hebrew alphabet. It served the dual purpose of the scholarly discourse in Hebrew, analogous to the use of medieval Latin in the West, and as a written alphabet for the various languages spoken in Khazaria, analogous to the use of the Latin alphabet for the various vernacular in the Western Europe. From Khazaria, the Hebrew script seems to have spread into neighboring countries. Thus, Chawazin reports that inscriptions in a non-Semitic language, or possibly in two different non-Semitic languages using Hebrew characters, were found on two gravestones from Pangoria and Parinit in the Crimea. They have not been deciphered yet. The Crimea was, as we have seen, intermittently under Khazar rule, but it also had an old established Jewish community, and the inscriptions may even predate the conversation. Some Hebrew letters, Shin and Tazadin, also found their way into the Cyrillic alphabet. And furthermore, many Polish silver coins have been found dating from the 12th or 13th century, which bears Polish inscription in Hebrew lettering, e.g. Leszek Poliski. Leszek, king of Poland, side by side, e.g. Leszek Królewski, Leszek, king of Poland, side by side with coins inscribed in the Latin alphabet. Polyg comments, these coins are the final evidence for the spreading of the Hebrew script from Khazaria to neighboring Slavic countries. The use of these coins was not related to any question of religion. They were minted because many Polish people were more used to this type of script than the Roman script, not considering it as specifically Jewish. Thus, while the conversation was no doubt inspired by optimistic motives, conceived as a cunning political maneuver, it brought in its wake cultural development, which could hardly have been foreseen by those who started it. The Hebrew alphabet was beginning. 3 centuries later, the decline of the Khazar state is marked by repeated outbreak of the Masonic Zionism, with the pseudo-messiahs like David El Rio, hero of a novel by Disraeli, leading Quixotic crusades for the reconquest of Jerusalem. After the defeat by the Arabs in 737, Kagan's forced adoption of Islam had been formally almost instant revolt, which apparently left no impression on his people. In contrast to this, the voluntary conversion to Judaism was to produce deep and lasting effects. It's page 63 on section 2 now. The circumstances of the conversion are obscured by legend, but the principal Arab and Hebrew accounts of it have been basic features of common. Al-Masadi's account of the Jewish rule in Khazaria, quoted earlier on, ends with a reference to the previous work of his, in which he gave a description of those circumstances that previous works of Masadi is lost. But there is this 2 accounts which are based on the lost book. The first by Damascus, written in 1327, reiterates that at the time of Harun al-Rashid, the Byzantine emperor forced the Jews to immigrate. These immigrants came to the Khazar country, where they found an intelligent but uneducated race of whom they offered their religion. The natives found it better than their own and accepted it. The natives found it better than their own and accepted it. The second, much more detailed account is the al-Bakri book of Kingdoms and Roads, 11th century. The reason for the conversion to Judaism of the king of the Khazars, who had previously been a pagan, is as follows. He had adopted Christianity. Then he recognized its falsehood, and high officials. I skipped a line. Then he recognized its falsehood and discussed this matter, which greatly worried him, with one of his high officials. The latter said to him, O king, those in possession of sacred scriptures fall into 3 groups. Summon them and ask them to state their case. Then follow the one who is in possession of the truth. Page 64. So he sent to the Christians for a bishop. Now there was with the king a Jew, skilled in argument, who engaged him in disputation. He asked the bishop, what do you say of Moses, the son of Amram, and the Torah, which was revealed to him? The bishop replied, Moses is a prophet and the Torah speaks the truth. Then the Jew said to the king, he has already admitted the truth of my creed. Ask him now what he believes in. So the king asked him, and he replied, I say that Jesus the Messiah is the son of Mary. He is the Word, and he was revealed the mysteries of the name of God. Then said the Jew to the king of the Khazars, he preaches a doctrine which I know not, while he accepts my positions, but the bishop was not strong in producing evidence. Then the king asked for a Muslim, and they sent him a scholarly, clever man who was good at arguments. But the Jew hired someone who poisoned him on the journey, and he died. And the Jew succeeded in winning the king for his faith, so he embraced Judaism. The Arab historians certainly had a gift for sugaring the pill. Had the Muslim scholar been able to participate in the debate, he would have fallen into the same trap as the bishop. They both accepted the truth of the Old Testament, whereas the upholders of the New Testament and of the Quran were each outvoted 2-1. The king's approval of this reasoning is symbolic. He is only willing to accept doctrines which are shared by all three. These common denominators are refused to commit themselves to any of the rival claims which go beyond them. It is once more the principle of the uncommitted word applied to theology. The story also implies, as Berry has pointed out, that Jewish influence at the Khazar court may already have been strong before the formal conversation, for the bishop and the Muslim scholar have to be sent for, whereas the Jew is already with him, the king. I don't know, this is thought, man. That's kind of skeptical right there. Not because I'm an Israelite, but if I'm not mistaken, I don't see that in our history of our forefathers that we poison people. Uh, 64, section 3. We now turn from the principal Arab source on the conversion, Masadi and his compilers, to the principal Jewish source. This is the so-called Khazar correspondence, an exchange of letters in Hebrew between Masadi Ibn Shabrut, the Jewish chief minister of the Caliph of Cordoba, and Joseph, king of the Khazars, or rather between their respective scribes. The authenticity of the correspondence has been the subject of controversy, but is now generally accepted with due allowance made for the vagaries of later copies. The exchange of letters apparently took place after 954 and before 961. That is roughly at the time when Masadi wrote. To appreciate its significance, a word must be said about the personality of Hasidiya ibn Shaprut, perhaps the most brilliant figure in the golden age 900 to 1200 of the Jews in Spain. In 929, Abd al-Rahman III, a member of the Umayyad dynasty, succeeding in unifying the Moorish possessions in the southern and central part of the Iberian Peninsula under his rule, and found the Western Caliphate. His capital, Cordoba, became the glory of Arab Spain and a focal center of European culture, with a library of 400,000 catalog volumes. Hasideh, born 910 in Cordoba into a distinguished Jewish family, first attracted the caliph's attention as a medical practitioner, with some remarkable cures to his credit. Abd al-Rahman appointed him his court physician and trusted his judgment so completely that Hasda called upon first to put the state finance in order, then to act as foreign minister and diplomatic troubleshooter in the new caliphate's complex dealing with Byzantine, the German Emperor Otto, with Castile, Navarra, Aragon, and the other Christian kingdoms in the north of Spain. Hasda was a true Uomo Universal century before the Renaissance, who in between affairs of state still found the time to translate medical books into Arabic, to correspond with learned rabbis of Baghdad, and to act as Neacanis for Hebrew, Neacanis for Hebrew, grammarians, and poets. He obviously was an enlightened yet devoted Jew who used his diplomatic contact to gather information about the Jewish community dispersed in various parts of the world. And to intervene on their behalf whenever possible. He was particularly concerned about the persecution of the Jews in the Byzantine Empire under Romanus, see above section 1. Fortunately, he wielded considerable influence at the Byzantine court, which was vitally interested in procuring the benevolent neutrality of Cordoba during the Byzantine campaign against the Muslims of the East. Hasda, who was conducting the negotiations, used his opportunity to intercede on behalf of the Byzantine Jewry, apparently with success. According to his account, Hasda first heard of the existence of the independent Jewish kingdom. Okay, let's see. Let's get down a little bit. It said details about the Khazar kingdom, including the name Joseph of its present king, Theopan Hasda, decided to send couriers with a letter to the king Joseph. The letter, which will be discussed in more detail later on, contains a list of questions about the Khazar state, its people, method of government, armed forces, and so on, including inquiry to which of the 12 tribes Joseph belonged. This seems to indicate that Hasda thought the Jewish Khazars to hail from Palestine, as the Spanish Jews did, perhaps even to represent one of the lost tribes. Joseph, not being of Jewish descent, belonged, of course, to none of the tribes. In his reply to Hasda, he provides, as we shall see, a genealogy of a different kind. But his main concern is to give Hasda a detailed, if legendary, account of the conversion, which took place 2 centuries earlier, and the circumstances that led to it. Joseph's narrative starts with a eulogy of his ancestor, King Bulan, a great conqueror and a wise man who drove out the sorcerers and idolaters from his land. Subsequently, an angel appeared to King Bulan in his dream, exhorting him to worship the only true God and promising in the exchange he would bless and multiply Bulan's offspring and deliver his enemies into his hand and make his kingdom last to the end of the world. Thus, of course, is inspired by the story of the covenant in Genesis. And it implies that the Khazars too claimed the status of a chosen race who made their own covenant with the Lord. Let's look at the word Lord. So I'm going to change it. Made their own covenant with the Lord, even though they were not descended from Abraham's seed. But at this point, Joseph's story takes an unexpected turn. King Bulan is quite willing to serve the Almighty, but he raises a difficulty. Thou knowest, my Lord, the secret thoughts of my heart, and thou hast searched my kidneys to confirm that my trust is in thee. But the people over which I rule have a pagan mind, and I do not know whether they will believe me. If I have found favor and mercy in thy eyes, then I beseech thee to appear also to their great prince, to make him support me. The Eternal One granted Bulan's request. He appeared to his prince in a dream, and when he arose in the morning, he came to the king and made it known to him. There is nothing in Genesis nor in the Arab account of the conversion about a great prince whose consent has to be obtained. It is unmistakably reference to Khazar double kinship. The great prince apparently is the Bet, but it is also not possible that the king was the Bet. And Prince the Kagan, moreover, according to Arab and Armenian sources, the leader of the Khazar army, which invaded Transcaucasia in 731, i.e. a few years before the presumed date of the conversion, was called Bulkan. Joseph's letter continues by returning how the angel appeared once more to the Dream King and bade him to build a place of worship in which the Lord may dwell. The sky and the skies above the sky are not large enough to hold me. King Bulan replies bashfully that he does not possess the gold and the silver required for such an enterprise. Although it is my duty and desire to carry it out, the angel reassures him all Bulan has to do is to lead his army into Galilee and Arabia in Armenia, where the treasure of silver and treasure of gold are awaiting. This fits with Bulan's and Bulan's raid preceding the conversion, and also with Arab sources according to which Khazars at one time controlled silver and gold mines in the Caucasus. Bulan does as the angel told him, returns victoriously with the loot and builds the holy tabernacle equipped with a sacred coffer, the Ark of the Covenant, a condobone, and an altar and holy implements which have been preserved to this day and are still implements which have been preserved to this day and are still in my King Joseph's possession. Joseph's letter, written in the second half of the 10th century, more than 200 years after the event, it reports to describe is obviously a mixture of facts and legend. His description of the scant furnishings of the place of worship and paucity of the preserved relic is in marked contrast to the account he gives in other parts of the letter of the present prosperity of his country. The days of his ancestor Bulan appears to him as remote antiquity, when the poor but the virtuous king did not even have the money to construct the holy tabernacle, which was, after all, only a tent. However, Joseph's letter up to this point is merely the prelude to the real drama of the conversation, which he now proceeds to relate. Apparently, Bulan's renunciation of idolatry in favor of the only true God was only the first step, which left the choice open between the three monotheistic creeds. At least this is what the communication of Joseph's letter seems to imply. After these feats of arms, the invasions of Armenia, King Bulan's fame spread to all countries. The king of Edom, Byzantine, and the king of Ismailim, the Muslim, heard the news and sent to him envoys with precious gifts and money, and learned men to convert him to their beliefs. But the king was wise and sent for a Jew with much knowledge and acumen, and put all three together to discuss their doctrines. So we have another brain trust or a round table conference, just as in Masudi, with the difference that the movement has not been poisoned beforehand. But the pattern of the argument is much the same. After long and futile discussion, the king adjourns the meeting for 3 days, during which the discontents are left to cool their heels in their respective tents. Then he reverts to a stratagem. He convokes the discontents separately. He asks the Christian, which is of the other two religions is merely the truth, and the Christian asks the Jews. He confronts the Muslim with the same question and gets the same reply. Neutralism has once more carried today. So much for the conversation. What else do we learn from the celebrated Khazar correspondence? To take Hazardai letter first, it starts with a Hebrew poem, and then fashionable manner of the Payat, the rhapsodic verse, in which contains skidding, illusion, or rhythm. Acrostics. The poem exalts the military victories and addresses the King Joseph. At the same time, the initial letters of the lines from the Christic which spells out the full name of Hasdea bar Isaac bar Ezra bar Shaput, followed by the name of Miniam ben Sharuk. Now his Miniam was a celebrated Hebrew poet, lexicographer, and grammarian, and secretary and prodigy of Hasdea. He was obviously given the task of drafting the epistle to King Joseph in his most ornate style, and he took the opportunity to immortalize himself by inserting his own name into the acrostic after that of his pattern. 7 other workers of Miniam ben Sharuk are preserved, and there can be no doubt that Hasdea's letter is his handiwork. After the poem, the compliments and diplomat flourishes. The letter gives glowing account of the prosperity of the Moorish Spain and the happy conditions of the Jews under its caliph Abd al-Rahman, the like of which has never been known. And thus the direct sheep were taken into care, and arms of their prosecutors were paralyzed, and the yoke was discarded. The country we live in is called in Hebrew shepherd, but in Ishmaelites who inhabit it call it Al-Andalus. Hasdi then proceeds to explain how he first heard about the existence of the Jewish kingdom from the merchants of Khurasan, then in more detail from Byzantine envoys and reports what the envoys told him. I questioned them, the Byzantines, about it, and they replied that it was true, but the name of the kingdom is Arab-Khazar. Between Constantinople and this country, there's a journey of 15 days by sea. But they said, by the land, there are many other people between us and them. The name of the ruling king is Joseph. Ships come to us from their land, bringing fish, furs, and all sorts of merchandise. They are in alliance with us and honored by us. We exchange embassies and gifts. They are powerful and have a fortress for their outposts and troops, which go out in forays from time to time. This bit of information offered by Hasdi to the Khazar king about the king's own country is obviously extended to draw a detailed reply from Joseph. It was good psychology. Hasdi must have known the criticism and erroneous statements flows easier from the pen than the original exposition. Next, Hasdale relates his earlier efforts to get in touch with Joseph. First, he had sent a messenger, a certain Isaac Bar Nathan, with instructions to proceed to the Khazar court. But Isaac got it only as far as the Constantinople, where he was courteously treated, but prevented from continuing the journey. Understandably so, given the empire's ambivalent attitude towards the Jewish kingdom, it was certainly not in Constantine's interest to facilitate an alliance between Khazaria and the Cordoba Caliphate with its Jewish chief minister. So Hasdale messenger returned to Spain, mission unaccomplished, but soon another opportunity offered itself. The arrival of Cordoba as an embassy from Eastern Europe among its members who were Jews, Marsaw, and Mar Joseph. He offered to deliver Hasdale's letter to King Joseph. All right, we're trying to move on a little bit. We go to a section called Exodus, and a little bit from there, and then a little bit from race and myth. The evidence, this is section 5, Exodus, section 1. The evidence quoted in the previous page indicates that, contrary to traditional view held by the 19th century historians, the Khazars, after the defeat by the Russians in 965, lost the empire but retained their independence within the narrow frontier and their Judaic faith well into the 13th century. They even seem to have reverted to some extent to their erstwhile predatory habits. Variant comments. In general, the reduced Khazar kingdom preserved, it waged a more or less effective defense against all foes until the middle of the 13th century, when all fell victim to the great Mongol invasion set in motion by Genghis Khan. Even then, it rested stubbornly until the surrender of all its neighbors. Its population was largely observed by the Golden Horde, which had established the center of its empire in Khazar territory. Before and after the Mongol upheaval, the Khazars sent many offshoots into the unsubdued Slavic lands, helping ultimately to build up the great Jewish centers of Eastern Europe. Here, then, we have the cradle of the numerically strongest and crucially dominant part of the modern Jewry. The offshoot to which Baron refers were indeed branching out long before the destruction of the Khazar state by the Mongols, as the ancient Hebrew nations had started branching into the diaspora long before the destruction of Jerusalem. I was looking, if I can interject for a second, because as I study and learn, thoughts pop in my head based on what I've learned. And according to the second stick, there's a map that said from the line of Judah, before they were taken into captivity, a branch broke off and came to the Americas about 600 BC, way before Christopher Columbus came over in 1492. And then what sparked that conversation where it talks about the ancient Hebrews, not the Khazars, Say the Hebrew nation, he said, as the ancient Hebrew nation has started branching into the diaspora long before the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's what sparked that thought that came from the second stick. So ethnically, the Semitic tribes on the waters of the Jordan and the Turco-Khazar tribes on the Volga were, of course, miles apart. They had at least two important formative factors in common. Each lived in a focal junction where the great trade routes connecting east and west, north and south intersect. A circumstance as you can see, part of you can see part of what I'm reading is like blanked out, so I can't really see what that says. Let's see, which is as I move on, them to become nations of traders, of enterprising travelers, are rootless cosmopolitans, as hostile propaganda has unaffectionately labeled them. But at the same time, their exclusive religion fostered a tendency to keep to themselves and stick together to establish their own communities with their own place of worship, schools, residential quarters, and ghettos originally self-imposed. I don't know, there's just certain key words that stick out to me. Who lives in the ghettos? Originally self-imposed. In whatever town or country they settled, this rare combination of wanderlust and ghetto mentality reinforced the Masonic hopes and chosen race pride. Both ancient Israelites and medieval Khazars shared, even though the latter traced their descents not to Shem, but to Japhet. All right, let's see what else I got. Yeah, it was something I saw. I was trying to. Let's see, where was that? All right, let's see what it says right here because I'm going to try to wrap it up. This is page 196, section 6. It says, in any discussion of the biological and social inheritance of the Jews, the shadow of the ghetto must loom large. The Jews of Europe and America, even North Africa, are children of the ghetto, and no more than 4 or 5 generations removed. Whatever their geographical origin, with the ghetto walls, they lived everywhere in more or less the same milieu, subjected for several centuries to the same formative or disformative influences. From the genetics point of view, we can distinguish 3 such major influences: inbreeding, genetic drift, selection. Inbreeding may have played at a different period a large part of Jewish racial history as its opposite, hybridization. From biblical times to the era of the enforced segregation, and again in modern times, miscegenation was the dominant trend. In between, there stretched 3 to 5 centuries, according to country, of isolation and inbreeding, both in the strict sense of consanguineous marriages and in the broader sense of endogamy within a small segregated group. Inbreeding carries the danger of bridging the deleterious recessive genes together and allowing them to take effect. The high incidence of congenital idiocy among Jews have been known for a long time and was in all probability a result of protracted inbreeding, and not, as some anthropologists asserted, a Semitic racial proclivity. Mental and physical malformations are conspicuously frequent in remote alpine villages, where most of the tombstones of the churchyard show one of half a dozen family names. There are no Cohens or Levi's amongst them. But inbreeding may also produce champion racehorses through favorable gene combinations. Perhaps it contributed to the production of both cretins and geniuses among the children of the ghetto. It reminds one of Cham Wiseman's dictum: "The Jews are like other people, only more so." But genetics has little information to offer in this field. Another process which may have profoundly affected people in the ghetto is genetic drift, also known as zero right effect. It refers to the loss of hereditary traits in small, isolated populations, either because none of its founding members happen to possess the corresponding genes, or because only few possess them but fail to transmit them to the next generation. Genetic drift can thus produce considerable transformation in the hereditary characteristics of small communities. The selective pressures active within the ghetto walls must have been of the intensity rare encountered in history. For one thing, since the Jews were debarred from the agriculture, they became completely urbanized, or you could say Hellenized, concentrated in towns and stelts, which became increasingly overcrowded. As a result, to quote Shapiro, the devastating epidemic that swept medieval cities and towns would in the long run have been more selective on Jewish populations than on any others, leaving them with progressively greater immunity as time went on, and their modern descendants would therefore represent the survivors of a rigorous or specific selective process. This, he thinks, may account for the rarity of the tuberculosis among Jews and their relative longevity, amply illustrated by statistics collected by Fishburne. The hostile pressure surrounding the ghetto ranged from cold contempt to sporadic acts of violence to organized pogroms. Several centuries of living in such conditions must have favored the survival of the glibest, the most pliant and mentally resilient. In a word, the ghetto type. Whether such physical traits are based on the hereditary disposition on which the selective process operates, or are transmitted by social inheritance through childhood conditioning, is a question still hotly disputed among anthropologists. We do not even know to what extent a high IQ is attributable to heredity, and to what extent to Malu. Take, for instance, the Jews' once proverbial extremousness, which some authorities on the alcoholism regarded as racial trait, but one can just as well interpret it as another inheritance from the ghetto. The unconscious residue of living for centuries under precarious conditions, which made it dangerous to lower one's guard. The Jew with the yellow star on his back had to be cautious and sober while watching with amused attempt the antics of the drunken goy. All right, so let me read this. Let's see what it says. The ideal of a son of Jacob was during the centuries before the middle of the 19th century, a silken young man. This was a delicate, anemic, willowy youth with a wistful expression, all brains and no brawn. But he continues in the Western Europe and America, there is present a strong tendency in the opposite direction. Many Jews are proud of the fact that they do not look like Jews. Considering this, it must be acknowledged that there are hardly a glowing future for the so-called Jewish caste of continents. Least of all, we may add among young Israelis. See, that's the key right there. See how this for consideration. This is me talking now, not what the book is saying. That's why it was so easy to take, and I'm speaking as my right to have a nationality. And it's already written, even this book has already shown us that the true Jews are from the scriptures are the Israelites. And that's who I am. I'm an Israelite. Now, it ended here speaking about the Khazars, Israelis. In the scripture, it says nothing about Israelis. It talks about Israelites. But you saw how they try to compare the two in such a close quarters. They try to say we both come from the ghetto. And actually we're nothing alike. Israelites, we're compassionate people, peaceful people. We don't have animalistic ways like eating meat, raw meat, and blood. That was mentioned in this book. We don't do those type of things. Unless we learn them by nature, we don't do those type of things. That's why the scripture says you should know them. You can use this in any aspect, but I'm just using these two, Israelites and Israelis. You should know them by their fruit. Now, there's certain things we've learned that are not the ways of either our forefathers, not even the ways of the Most High. We learn them by taking on the ways of the heathen. But there's just certain things you can just point and say, oh, no, we don't do that type of stuff. No, that couldn't have been them. They don't do that type of stuff. So this is an interesting book. And then, like I said, even the book points out that they're converts. They're not the people of the book. They're not the bloodline relatives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, there's so many other evidences now that's coming out now today that points it out as well. So, man, excuse me, I look so tired. It's my fault though. Instead of going to sleep, and I'll be up reading books and writing down information from the scriptures. And so I love to do that. So that's what I do a lot of times instead of going to sleep. I'll sleep about 3 in the morning every day, every morning. So 2 to 3 in the morning. Truthfully, from 1 to 3 in the morning, I usually go to sleep. So I'm a little tired, so that's okay. This is just interesting to me, especially when that second stick came out. Man, it had so much more information than I was listening to Book of Jasper. It had so much information than what the first stick tells us. So this is exciting information to me. So I stay up, whether I'm reading or listening to it on the internet. So. All right, so I would tell you, go ahead and get this book, read it. And like any other book, like you people use the word, it got bones in it, because by human nature, most people are going to interject their own personal feelings into stuff. That's just human nature. Even the people that tells the truth, they most time they want to add at least a couple of statements that's going to at least make their side look better. So I don't know if he did that or not, but that's what usually people do. But he's told a lot of truth in there though. So until next time, shalom.